Everyone knows the Union Pacific Big Boy, 4,000 horsepower, 6,000 tons of freight, the biggest, most powerful steam locomotive ever built. For generations, it's reigned as the undisputed king of the rails, the machine that proved American engineering could conquer any mountain, haul any load, break any record. But buried in the archives of Australian railway history lies a locomotive that did something Big Boy never could. It hauled comparable tonnage over steeper grades while burning 40% less coal per ton-mile. 40%. Not a modest improvement, not a marginal gain, a complete rewriting of what was possible in steam locomotive efficiency. How did an obscure Australian machine achieve what the most famous locomotive in history could not? And why did the world forget its triumph? The story begins in 1943, when the New South Wales Government Railways faced a crisis that American engineers couldn't fathom. The Blue Mountains west of Sydney weren't just steep. They were a geological nightmare for railway operations. Grades climbed at 1 in 33, sometimes steeper, through curves so tight they could snap a conventional locomotive's frame. The coal traffic from the western coalfields to Sydney demanded tonnage, thousands of tons every week. But the mountains devoured coal faster than the trains could deliver it. Standard articulated locomotives, the massive mallets that dominated American freight service, couldn't handle it. Their fixed wheelbase couldn't navigate the curves. Their coal consumption on those grades made the entire operation economically absurd. You'd burn nearly as much coal getting coal to Sydney as you'd deliver. Engineers at the NSWGR locomotive workshops in Cardiff studied the problem with the kind of desperation that breeds innovation. They needed unprecedented power for the grades, unprecedented flexibility for the curves, and fuel efficiency that defied every conventional wisdom about steam locomotive performance. The answer came from an unlikely source. Herbert William Garratt, a British engineer, had patented an articulated design in 1907 that railway administrations around the world had mostly ignored. Instead of hanging the boiler and cab on a rigid frame between two sets of driving wheels, Garratt split everything apart. Two separate engine units, each with its own wheels and cylinders, connected by a central frame that carried the boiler and cab. The entire locomotive could flex and twist through curves like a serpent while maintaining traction on both engine units. It looked absurd. It violated every aesthetic principle of locomotive design. Where American locomotives presented clean lines and massive integrated power, the Garratt looked like it had been assembled from spare parts by a committee that couldn't agree on anything. But the physics were undeniable. By separating the engine units from the boiler, Garratt's design allowed for a massive firebox that sat over the frame instead of being constrained between the wheels. Larger firebox meant more complete combustion. More complete combustion meant more heat extracted from every pound of coal, and more heat meant more steam for the same fuel input. The NSWGR ordered their first Garratts in 1952, Class AD60s built by Beyer-Peacock in Manchester. When they arrived in Sydney and began trials on the Blue Mountains route, the test results bordered on the impossible. Empty weight, 264 tons. Total weight with tender loaded, 264 tons. Maximum tractive effort at 85% boiler pressure, 63,390 pounds of force. Power output, approximately 4,200 indicated horsepower, matching Big Boy's nominal rating despite being a significantly lighter machine. But the fuel consumption numbers stopped engineers mid-sentence when they read the reports. On the ruling grade between Lithgow and Bell, climbing at 1 in 33 with a 1,200-ton train, the AD60 consumed 74 pounds of coal per mile. For context, that same tonnage on that same grade would have required a typical American articulated to burn over 120 pounds per mile. Some estimates ran higher. Per ton mile, the AD60 achieved fuel efficiency ratings around 0.071 pounds of coal. Big Boy, hauling freight over Sherman Hill in Wyoming, typically consumed between 0.095 and 0.11 pounds of coal per ton mile, depending on conditions. Do the math. The Australian locomotive was burning 40 to 45% less coal to move the same weight over comparable or steeper terrain. This wasn't a fluke. This wasn't favorable conditions or cherry-picked data. Across thousands of service hours, through every season, in rain and drought, the AD60 maintained fuel consumption rates that would have seemed like accounting errors to American railway engineers. The secret lay in combustion efficiency, and the Garratt design's ability to optimize it in ways conventional locomotives couldn't match. American articulated locomotives, even the mighty Big Boy, had to compromise. The firebox sat between the rear driving wheels, constrained by the wheelbase and the need to maintain sufficient axle spacing for stability. This geometric prison limited firebox volume and restricted the engineer's ability to design for complete combustion. Coal burned, certainly. Steam was produced, absolutely. But unburned particles went up the stack. Heat escaped before it could transfer to the water. Efficiency suffered. The AD60's firebox volume measured 69.3 cubic feet of combustion space, fed by a great area of 69.3 square feet. Big Boy's firebox, despite being part of a larger locomotive, offered only 150.3 square feet of great area for a boiler that had to produce substantially more steam to move its own greater weight. The ratio of firebox volume to great area in the Garratt allowed for a longer, more complete burn cycle. Coal had time to release every BTU before the exhaust gases left the system. British and Australian engineers had learned something about coal combustion that American designers, obsessed with raw power and maximum capacity, often overlooked. You could make more steam, or you could make steam more efficiently. The Americans chose power. The Australians chose efficiency. And on routes where every pound of coal had to be hauled up mountains before it could be used, efficiency meant survival. The AD60 also benefited from better weight distribution. By placing the boiler on the central frame between two separate engine units, the design allowed each engine unit to carry less dead weight. More of the locomotive's mass contributed to adhesion. Less was wasted on structural support for the boiler. When calculating tractive effort against weight on drivers, the Garratt achieved ratios that conventional designs couldn't approach. In service, the difference became visceral. Crews who transferred from standard locomotives to the AD60 talked about the smoothness, the way the machine seemed to flow through curves rather than fight them. On the 1 in 33 grades, where conventional locomotives labored with every revolution, the Garratt climbed with what veteran engineers described as mechanical confidence. The exhaust beat was steady, controlled. The coal consumption, monitored religiously by efficiency-obsessed railway accountants, stayed within predictable parameters month after month. Meanwhile, in America, Big Boy had become mythology. Union Pacific's publicity machine, one of the most effective corporate marketing operations in the 20th century, had turned the Class 4000 into a symbol of American industrial might. Photographers staged dramatic shots. Journalists wrote breathless features. The dimensions became legend: 132 feet long, 560 tons loaded, pulling a mile of freight cars across the Continental Divide. Every number, every statistic, every public appearance reinforced the narrative. Big Boy was the ultimate achievement in steam locomotive engineering. Nothing else compared. Nothing else could compare. And to be fair, Big Boy was extraordinary. 25 were built between 1941 and 1944. They hauled astonishing tonnages over Sherman Hill, reducing the need for helper locomotives and revolutionizing Union Pacific's freight operations. For their specific purpose, on their specific routes, they were exactly what the railroad needed. But ultimate achievement, the pinnacle beyond which no improvement was possible, the AD60 existed, 42 of them, hauling coal and freight over some of the most difficult railway terrain in the world, burning 40% less fuel per ton-mile than the machine everyone called the greatest steam locomotive ever built. Why didn't the world know? Geography played a role. Australia, even in the 1950s, occupied the periphery of global consciousness. American and European engineering achievements dominated technical journals. Australian innovations, no matter how significant, struggled for international attention. The AD60 operated on a continent where most of the world's engineering community never traveled, hauling freight most international observers never saw, over routes that appeared on no one's list of famous railways. Timing mattered too. The AD60s entered service just as diesel-electric locomotives began their unstoppable conquest of the world's railways. By the time the Garratts proved their superiority in fuel efficiency, the entire question of coal consumption in steam locomotives had become academically irrelevant. The future was diesel. Steam, no matter how efficient, was the past. But marketing was the killer blow. Union Pacific understood narrative in ways the New South Wales government railways never attempted. Big Boy had a name that sounded powerful, memorable, American. AD60 sounded like a filing code. Big Boy had publicity events, museum preservation, corporate identity. The AD60 had service records and maintenance logs. Big Boy represented conquest, expansion, the taming of a continent. The AD60 represented operational efficiency in moving coal over mountains. Which story sells better? By the 1970s, the AD60s began disappearing, scrapped for steel, cut up in railway yards. A few survived for heritage railways, but most were reduced to recyclable metal before anyone thought to preserve them as monuments to engineering achievement. Big Boy, meanwhile, became immortal. Union Pacific preserved 8 of them. Museums displayed them as centerpieces. In 2019, Union Pacific restored number 4014 to operation, spending millions to make a 75-year-old locomotive run again for public excursions. The news coverage was international. The crowds were massive. The symbolic power was undeniable. No one has ever suggested spending similar money to restore an AD60 to mainline operation, though the engineering case would be equally compelling. This is how history works, not the careful weighing of technical achievements, not the objective comparison of data and performance metrics, but the accumulation of narratives, the reinforcement of legends, the amplification of what people already believe. Big Boy became famous because it looked powerful, operated in a country with global media reach, and served a corporation that understood publicity. The AD60 remained obscure because it looked strange, operated in a country on the edge of global awareness, and served a government railway that cared more about moving freight than building legends. The engineering truth remains, preserved in service records, fuel consumption data, and the testimony of the men who operated both machines. The Australian locomotive that almost no one remembers achieved fuel efficiency that the most famous steam locomotive in history could not match. 40% better. Not in theory, not in laboratory conditions, in daily service, across years of operation, hauling real tonnage over real grades in real weather. The numbers don't lie, even when the world forgets to look at them. So what do we make of this disparity between achievement and recognition? What does it say about how we construct our understanding of engineering history? Perhaps it suggests that the machines we celebrate reveal less about absolute performance than about the stories we want to tell ourselves. Big Boy represents American industrial confidence at its peak, the belief that bigger and more powerful equals better, the aesthetic of overwhelming force applied to overcome any obstacle. That narrative resonated in 1940s America and continues to resonate today because it aligns with how Americans prefer to see themselves. The AD60 represents a different philosophy entirely: efficiency over power, optimization over maximization, the patient work of extracting the most possible performance from every unit of input, even if the result looks ungainly and requires explanation to appreciate. One approach built legends, the other hauled freight. In the end, both locomotives did exactly what their creators needed them to do. Big Boy conquered Sherman Hill and became a symbol. The AD60 solved the Blue Mountains coal traffic problem and disappeared into obscurity. But for anyone who cares about what's actually true, rather than what's widely believed, the lesson is clear. Fame and achievement are not the same thing. The most celebrated solution is not always the best solution, and sometimes the machines that history forgets were the ones that worked the best. The Australian locomotive that embarrassed Big Boy in fuel efficiency exists in the historical record for anyone willing to look. The question is whether we value looking or whether we prefer the comfort of the stories we already know.